Hello everybody, Neon here for another edition of Game of the Week brought to you by a+space Games. Before we get into it, I just want to quickly tell you about Ink Gaming. I'm sure that you know about this, being part of the Eternal community, but they are now sponsoring a+space Games. Be sure to check out the site and use the promo code a+space12 to get 12% off your order of a lot of wicked gaming gear. So without any further ado, let's jump right into talking about the decks. This is the finals of the ETS that happened this weekend. I didn't get a chance to do the review the stream yet for the Direwolf Digital event that happened this weekend. I'm going to probably do that and then maybe have that one for next week. But for this one is going to be covering the finals of the ETS event. This was an excellent game between Jez and Paradox. We're going to start by talking about Jez's deck. Jez is on a JPS Midrange deck, which is a little bit unusual of a deck. This is actually something I find very interesting about it. It's the more unique of the two decks that we're going to look at. And this is definitely not a control deck, which is usually what you associate with the Justice Primal Shadow decks. This is very mid-rangey. We see a lot of units. We see Mokto, we see Nostrix, we see Black Sky Harbinger, and even the Huru pacifiers are in there as well. So this is a very mid-rangey deck. A couple cards that I want to point out. The matchup here that we're against is against the Haunted Highwayman deck. So a Fire, Primal, Shadow, Scream deck. So a few cards that are particularly good in that matchup. We have 3 copies of Rindra's Choice, which is a really bold call, I'll say. And I think that there's no weekend better than this one to play Rindra's Choice. So I'm very happy to see that here, and a really smart deck building decision in a matchup like this and against a lot of other decks. Another card excellent in this matchup is Shakedown. Basically, their entire deck can be discarded with it, and the information is so crucial of being able to either pick apart a Madness plus Combust combo or just identifying the fact that it's there. So really, really strong deck inclusions there. Also, just want to briefly mention the contents of the market. The Huru banner, Permafrost, Vision of Austerity, Mirror Image, and Nostrix. You guys, if you've paid attention to what I've been saying before in a lot of other places, I love seeing banners in the market. Thank goodness it's in this style of deck. I think that it would really bother me if it wasn't. This is definitely the kind of deck that really wants that, because you need to be able to hit 5 and 6 on time, and you have basically no card draw. You have 4 copies of Strategize, I mean, so it's not nothing, but you have very little. So having that is really, really useful in this deck. So I think this is a really well done version of this deck. I don't think that it's going to be great in this matchup particularly. We'll talk about that later, but I'm definitely interested to see where this deck goes from here, because this is an innovative build for sure. The opponent is going to be Paradox, who is on the Haunted Highwayman deck. This is the Fire, Shadow, Primal version of the Scream decks, and unlike the 2-faction versions, the straight Felm versions, this ends up playing out much more like a burn deck. If you're not familiar with it, that you use combination of Haunting Scream and Haunted Highwayman and these charge units to just push in a bunch of damage, use Nightfall triggers, etc., to all accumulate just enough damage to finish at the game a lot of the times. Unlike the Screen decks that are just the 2-faction version, which have a little bit more of a fair game plan and then kind of switch to the unfair game plan to finish things out if they have to. This is a little bit more all-in, unfair in kind of how it feels. So it's a hard deck to really explain unless you've played with it or against it. If you haven't played with or against it, I would advise trying it out. It's quite strong and definitely something that's worth being familiar with. A couple of things to note here. Obviously, this is very weak to the Rindra's Choice, which is a wonderful inclusion in the opponent's deck. We also have the composition of the market: Combust, Dark Return, Haunting Scream, Madness, and Vicious Highwayman. This is a pretty typical composition of the market, but it comes up in the course of the game, so I just wanted to draw attention to that. Other things that maybe I would want to mention, I don't think there's anything else here. I guess the shakedowns are somewhat new to the deck, which is a strong inclusion, though. Of course, it's a very strong addition to this kind of deck. You're vulnerable to the Rindra's Choice, as I mentioned, but more importantly, things like Valkyrie Enforcer or Desert Marshal or Torch, etc. So having a tool like that to clear things out is really wonderful. Although this isn't a particularly innovative take on the list, I think that it's a smart choice to bring this right now, and I could see an argument that this is one of the top tier decks, or some version of the Scream builds, and this is one that is definitely scary in some capacity. So with that, I'm going to leave it there. Let's get into the game. So, as I said, this is the finals of the ETS that happened this weekend. We can already see here some of the awkwardness that we can get in this Haunted Highwayman deck with this opening hand is not exactly smooth in terms of the power base. So this is one of the difficulties that you're going to run into in this deck, because it has really serious faction requirements just very early on in the game, and you want to have double primal, double fire on turn 2 if you can. I mean, that's not really particularly feasible, but you want to have it as early as possible to turn on your Champions of Fury, and then alternatively you also want to have that double shadow very soon as well. Keeping that torch on the bottom, rather, putting it on the bottom, reason why there's not a lot of great targets in Jez's deck. It can hit the Valkyrie Enforcer. Outside of that, there's not a lot of great options. Shakedown here, you have two possible choices, either the Champion of Fury or the Haunting Scream. Ends up opting for the Haunting Scream, which I can definitely respect. This is a card that can cause a lot of damage sort of out of nowhere under a lot of different situations. So getting rid of that, cleaning things up will make it easier to process damage in the future, and you also have both the Render's Choice and the Valkyrie Enforcer to deal with that Champion of Fury, kind of no matter how you want to do it. So I can definitely respect that, though I think that there's a part of me that really wants to use that Render's Choice right now. I think that he ends up leaving this for the Valkyrie Enforcer to silence, which I can respect. And given the fact that the Valkyrie Enforcer, I mean, it's quite good in this matchup, but it's usually going to be hitting something after it's already got some damage in, because most of Paradox's cards do in fact have charge. So now Paradox has a decision of whether or not to play out the Highwayman or the Queen. I personally really like playing out the Queen because you are basically guaranteed to get in that 6 damage. There's no card that that Jez has access to that's going to stop you. I mean, obviously they could jump block. Ends up instead going for this Vicious Highwayman play, which I feel is a little bit too cute. I mean, I kind of get that you get to set out this trade, but I mean, they're just going to block the Highwayman like this. And also the Highwayman is particularly good against the Shelter Wing Riders, which is a card that you are not good against. You really don't want to spend an entire card to be able to ping off the Aegis or whatever to deal with that. So anyway, on to Jez's turn. Exchanges a Slay for a banner. Very rarely are going to see somebody send Slay away to the market against a unit-heavy deck, but this is actually one of the few cases in which it's actually correct to do so, given the fact that your opponent's stuff almost all has charge, or maybe you have like little crappy bodies like the Grand Iron drones you don't really want to be slaying exactly. It's just kind of a little bit too slow for this matchup. So maybe it would have been better to send the Nostrix away, but still, I think that that choice is quite solid and quite defensible, and it's an unusual one. So Paradox now does have options, can play out the Queen and just jam for damage, or could try to set something up with the Merchant. It's not clear exactly what you would want to get from the market from this position. Just a quick review: composition of the market, Dark Return, Vicious Highwayman, Madness, Combust, and Haunting Scream. But not going to opt for that, going to go right into the combat phase, jamming that Queen, hoping to get 7 damage. Unfortunately, the Queen gets taken down by the Render's Choice, only 3 damage, down to 15 though, which is a scary number for against a deck like this. Nostrix going to come down and buff the Merchant. This is a wonderful play. As I sort of implied earlier, Paradox's deck really hates dealing with Aegis units because you really want to be able to Madness them. So that's a frustrating thing of dealing with this 8/7 Aegis blocker. The Merchant does come down. Options once again: Dark Return, Haunting Scream, Madness, Vicious Highwayman, Combust are what we have right here. not sure exactly what you want. Madness is really tempting, as it will allow to get a lot of damage in, depending on how your opponent plays out the coming turns. And really, as I kind of mentioned earlier, this is a quasi-burn deck. You're trying to really set up as much damage as you can under a lot of situations, and Madness is a great tool for that effect. Vicious Highwayman, not great in this position, given the fact that you have an Aegis blocker on the other side. Hard to take that off the battlefield, given the cards that you have in hand right now. The question, of course, is also what you want to send back to the market into the situation. Could technically go with the Grenadin drone, although it's not great here, because especially given the fact that it's a 2/2, ends up sending the banner back, getting that Madness. Unfortunately, though, Jez does draw the Shakedown, which can take the Madness out of Paradox's hand. Really good play here, though, by the way. Jez had the opportunity to play Nostrix in this situation, which is really tempting given the fact that it uses your power more efficiently, but Paradox's market is basically exclusively these cheap cards like Combust and Madness, etc., or Haunting Scream, and getting one of those out of your opponent's hand in this situation is really powerful, because especially imagine that, for instance, he plays the Nostrix, he buffs up one of his units, and then it gets Madness, and that's really just a disaster. Now, the way in which these discard cards typically work is that, of course, now another copy of the card goes directly on top of the deck for Paradox. We're going to return to this moment in the playback later on, but Paradox does decide to just attack in with a 2/1 deadly unit, sending the opponent down to 13, goes down to 12 as a result of the Nightfall trigger. Jez now has a difficult decision on their hands of exactly how to manage things. I guess it's not that difficult. They have really the choice of being able to mentor up one of the units. That's obviously not a good choice, given how much pressure you're under and how low your life total is. So really the only question is whether or not you play Mokto or the Nostrix. I think this is almost a strictly better choice, given the fact that you want to be able to trade that with for instance, the Deadly unit or something like this. So Paradox now still has a lot of options on their hands. Can Shakedown, probably not going to hit anything. I don't think that anybody's expecting to hit anything here, but I mean, maybe it has something. The other possibility is holding this until later, which would in some ways be a helpful thing to do if you're when you're playing on a high value unit, to be able to clear out something like a Rinder's Choice, although Rinder's Choice is going to get its money one way or another. Paradox going to try and push in 2 damage here. This ends up trading with the Mokto, which is a pretty good exchange of going with the 2/1 for the 5/5 flyer. Jez does a scout, sees actually that's a pacifier. We can't see it from here, but there's a pacifier on the top of the deck. That's an attractive play because it allows to do a double play in one turn, depending on what other cards are in the deck. Has the option of playing out the Nostrix or the Mokto. I'm personally more interested in playing out the Nostrix here, buffing nothing, because that means that next turn, even with your current power count, you can play the pacifier plus the second Mokto, which is quite a strong play. Building up things and being able to play 2 cards in one turn is quite strong. Ends up instead going for the Mokto, though I'm not sure what the thinking is here. I mean, I guess it's just more preferable card to trade with. Okay, so now we have some decisions to make with Paradox, given that we have the Dark Return. Some of the possibilities here include Vicious Highwayman, we have a Queen there, we have the Merchant as well to pull out of the market. And you as I mentioned earlier, this is functionally a burn deck in some ways. Ends up going for the Merchant, but the question is whether or not you play it out right now. Now, I'm going to skip over a good amount of this because there's a big, long tanking session, and I want to go through all the different possibilities at the end here in order to analyze what is going to happen in this juncture. But Paradox definitely takes their time in pondering over the different possibilities here. Ends up at the end deciding to not play the Merchant and passes the turn. Now, Jez is under a lot of pressure, but they still do have a few choices here. One of the plays they actually end up setting up, which I quite like, is they attack for 5 with the Nostrix, play out the 2 pacifiers with the objective of setting up lethal here. We now have 16 damage in the air, and this is important against a deck like Your Paradox has all these recursion engines, especially, you have this Corendon Merchant, plus you can get something like the Haunting Scream. There's a lot of ways for you to grind your opponent out, getting a few points of damage in here, a few points of damage in there. So decides to just set up a kill for next turn on Jez's side, forcing Paradox to maybe not take as much time as they would want. Now, on Paradox's side, there are a lot of decisions that are possible. With that Corendon Merchant in hand, there's always just a bunch of things that you can be doing. So, Corendon Merchant, you have access to the Haunting Scream, Dark Return, Vicious Highwayman, Combust, and a banner. Obviously, you don't want the banner because you have enough power to function pretty effectively right now. There is no madness left because you used that earlier, but you're trying to find a way to set up the last little bit of damage in this situation. The madness plus combust combination is probably one that sticks out to you as being particularly good in this hand, but I'm not sure whether you want to be using it at the moment. Now, this is the play that I want to highlight in this turn right now, playing up the banner and then pause, which indicates that Paradox hasn't thought out their entire turn quite yet. Now, this will be another point when we jump forward a little bit because there's a lot that we can think through in this situation. Paradox thinks about it very carefully. I don't actually return to this one at the end, so give me your thoughts of what you would do in this situation. Makto is stolen with the madness, decides now of what to be torching or combusting or whatever. There's a lot of choices in this situation. Ends up taking for a moment. Once again, this is the idea of, I think that it's worth making sure that you have the entire turn planned out and then taking an action. Maybe he was just prompted by the tournament organizer because he had been paused for like a full 2 minutes since the previous action. So decides to attack with just the Makto, which I can actually, no, he does take that back. He decides first to combust the pacifier, I believe. Yeah. So it goes for that. Then it decides to attack and with the Makto, and attacks him with everything, actually. This for the hope of trying to set up lethal. The downside of this is that there's a good possibility that you can be virtually dead on the way back. There's a lot of ways in which you for instance, getting hit by both like Makto plus the 5/7 plus the 8/7, that's 18 damage. But obviously there are ways that you can alleviate that. For instance, playing out the Merchant is a good way to block that damage. There was a moment there where Jez almost died to the Torch in hand, but decides to play around Torch by blocking the Makto in this way, chumping it, and only taking that 4 damage. So good play for Jez there, sensing that there was this burn spell in hand, probably picking up the pauses earlier, like always remember your pauses. But yeah, we get the combust here, which is obviously quite strong at getting that Makto in the deck, killing out that 5/7, but there's only that 8/7 left, but that's still no trivial matter. But that permafrost off the top for Jez is clutch. Now, obviously, you don't want to be using the Mentor ability right now off of the Nostrix. There's a time for place in that, but it's not right now in my opinion. Just put it down as a 5/7 blocker, permafrost the deadly unit, and now Paradox is in a very bad position. Forced to top deck, does hit a Dusk Raider, which is decent, but not enough to take care of things just yet. Makto comes off the top of the deck for Jez, goes down to 5 life due to that Nightfall trigger. The cards in hand for Jez are not great, but might not need to be very great in this position with their opponent only at 16. And that also goes to show that that 5 damage that got in earlier in the game is quite substantial, and that damage that we've seen over the course of the game with the Nightfall triggers is also added up. Jez not playing scared. I like this. This is a good way to end the game. You want to do that in this position. You have to finish the game. And especially now you have also lethal in the air. Next turn, your opponent is going to be taking 1 damage from the Nightfall trigger. There's a question of whether or not you want to be attacking with the Makto or with the Nostrix. I think that I think that you want to be doing it with the Nostrix, given the fact that, for instance, if your opponent finds something like a Combust, will combust the 3/2 under the permafrost to hit the 5/5 revenge unit, and now that it's in the deck, and that's actually a problem for your opponent, as opposed to having the 5/7 just die on, which doesn't do anything. Does draw the Champion Fury. As long as you block that with one of your units and any of the 2/2s, then you will be good, and you'll be able to set up lethal for next turn. And it is just barely staying alive for Jez, 1 life. And this one has got to hurt for Paradox. Now, Paradox does go on to win the event. Congratulations to him, but a very good game, one way or another. So let's go back to some of those key moments. Okay, so we're going back to in the mid-ish game, beginning of the mid-game. This situation, let's actually do some math here, because I think that is important. You have your opponent at 15. If you madness the 5/7, you can then attack for a guaranteed 5, and you attack in with everything else, and you're guaranteed to get 5 damage in, given the fact that your opponent only has 1 blocker. They have 1 card in hand, so it could end up being a removal spell, such as the Rindra's Choice, which is worrisome. You don't want to run into that. But if it's not Rindra's Choice, you actually have lethal here. Given the fact that you have the Torch in hand, you have the Nightfall trigger that's going to be happening next turn, given the fact that it's a night right now from your opponent's shakedown, and then you have the Waystone in hand that can actually finish things up, and that's also like you're left with a number of units in play that even if your opponent gains 1 life somehow, which I don't think they have access to, the only life gain effect that they really have access to is the Black Sky Harbinger. Even in their market, they don't have any life gain effects or armor gain effects. You pretty much have an almost guaranteed lethal, assuming they don't have exactly Rindra's Choice in hand. So it may not look like it, but this is the kind of thing you always have to be looking for in this deck, is that there's a lot of lines that can lead to lethal, and Paradox didn't see it here, and I think that that would have been a really clever play. So let's move on to the next moment. So this is the next turn right after this. We got a couple of damage in with our Merchant the previous turn. Our opponent played a Mokdo. Let's check our math once again. We can madness the Mokdo. That needs to be blocked by the Nostrix. Attack with everything else. Our 3/3 gets blocked. That means 7 damage gets through. We have a Nightfall trigger that's happening next turn. Torch in hand, and we have a Shakedown in hand that can deal another damage as well. Now we have to play the Shakedown next turn because of the way that the Nightfall triggers work, but because if we play it this turn, then the night will end on our next turn. But I think that we once again do have lethal here. Paradox just didn't see this line, but once again, like when you're in these mid to late game situations, when you have a lot of options, especially with Madness in hand, there's a lot of ways that you can find some really funky lethals, and at this point probably should know that there's no Rindra's Choice in hand, because you probably would have seen the pause the previous turn. Okay, so we're moving on to the next situation, and now we have the Dark Return in our hand, and we need to decide what we're going to be pulling from the void given the situation. Now, in many respects, if we can't set up lethal right now, the Corendon Merchant is strictly better than the other choices, since it gives you access to another Dark Return. So let's do the math for both Highwayman and Queen to see if either one of those can set up for a 1 or 2 turn lethal, because we would want to go for one of those if either one of those gives us lethal when the Corendon Merchant doesn't right now. So let's start off with doing the Highwayman math. Okay, so if we Highwayman, we have a 5/3 Highwayman, able to pull that out, shoot face, they're down to 10. We can also Madness the Mokdo with the power that we have left over if we play out the banner that we have in our hand. That means that when we're attacking in, the Nostrix has to block the Mokdo, and the Merchant has to block the Highwayman. Then that means that our 3/3, our 1/1, and our 2/2/2s are all able to hit face. So that's 8 damage. We get the 1 damage off of the Vicious Highwayman, and we have a Torch in hand. So once again, we actually have lethal again. Unfortunately, we also get a Nightfall trigger in there as well for a good measure. So this is actually another lethal setup that Paradox had access to. Just a 2-turn lethal. Not quite lethal this turn, but a very consistent 2-turn lethal that probably also is only vulnerable. Like if they do have a Rindra's Choice, somehow they just drew it this turn, then they would only be at 1 life left, in which case you only need to find 1 Nightfall trigger to finish off the game. So now with that, let's move on to talking about the Queen math. So, Dark Return, Queen, play that, well, first then we Madness the Mocto, play out the Queen, attack with everything. Mocto is blocked by Nostrix. Queen, which is now a 5/3, is blocked by the Merchant. Now we get our 3/3 becomes a 4/3, our 2/2s become 3/2s, and our 1/1 becomes a 2/1. So that is 4 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2 damage. That's 12 damage. Our opponent is at 11. So that's lethal. Once again, that is missing. In fact, this is a lethal that also is you plays around Rindra's choice too, which is the only card that you could have in this situation. So I guess that the only thing that you lose to is Rindra's choice in hand plus a Black Sky Harbinger on the top of the deck. You're not even in any jeopardy of losing to the backswing. So I mean, I'm giving your Paradox a bit of a hard time here, but I mean, like, he did miss a lot of lethal, but at the same time, probably was most fixated on the Merchant in this situation, since it seems like the most attractive play in many ways. There's a lot of fancy possibilities there. That's where my eyes goes to as well. I mean, just seeing on top of the deck might make you trigger you to think about it in that way. So anyway, let's move on from that and then talk about what the possibilities are with the Merchant, and why, how we should play it. So we play at the Merchant in this situation. The cards that remain in the market, showing up on the screen right now, we have Madness, it has been used already, but we have the Vicious Highwayman, Dark Return, Combust, and Haunting Scream that are left, all of which are pretty attractive options in their different ways. I'm going to have to just talk about these just for a moment before we move back to the main screen. Vicious Highwayman, we already have one in the Void. It's not a huge advantage one way or another of either we're getting it out of via Dark Return over the Vicious Highwayman. I mean, the Dark Return gives you an extra stat. The Highwayman costs one less. We're a little bit stretched on power here, especially given the fact that we probably want to send the banner back to the market. The Haunting Scream does a lot of the same things as the Highwayman, though, as well, costing even less power, given the fact that we can get the Highwayman out of our Void, and we probably want to just kind of end the game as soon as possible. So those are both interesting options in that respect. Combust is very attractive, though, and probably one of the cards that sort of attracted a lot of attention and thought in this situation, because it had such a convenient pairing with the Madness that's in your hand. So given that, let's essentially just like problem solve this based on the idea of, like, let's say that we top decked a Merchant, not the Dark Return that bailed us out of the situation and gave us other options for lethal. So first we want to do, before we look at the main board, is just imagine what are the different possibilities for our opponent to draw right here. It is night, so it means that they can draw up to 2 blockers, I think. So we have to come up with a plan based on this of what we can do to manage 2 blockers that could come out on the situation. They're functionally at 10. Remember, the Madness here has been used already in the course of this game. Both Haunting Scream and Vicious Highwayman, as I mentioned, are roughly the same. Same with Dark Return is very similar to that. The only one that really stands out as being substantially different than the others is Combust. And I'm sort of wondering, how good it is. Like, you could just use Combust, like Madness to attack in with the Mocto, which is a lot of damage that they really can't let through, and then torch the Nostrix to finish things up. And that's a really attractive play under a lot of situations if you're really that inclined to play for value, essentially. But especially given that your opponent is functionally at 10, you have a torch in hand, you really only need to deal 7 damage. There's a lot of reasons why I'm very interested in playing out either the Highwayman or the Haunting Scream or the Dark Return. And I'm personally inclined to say right now that it almost doesn't matter which one. I think that probably not the Highwayman is the best. So of these, then, I do think that the Dark Return is probably the best, since it does a lot of the same things as Highwayman, but you can also get the Queen, which is, I think, a higher damage output. So with that, then, let's process through of what the turn would look like if we did grab the Dark Return and then Dark Return the Queen and figure out exactly how much damage we'd be able to generate. This turn, we play Merchant. So Dark Return, we grab the Merchant, we play the Merchant, we trade the banner for the Dark Return that's in the market, we then Dark Return for the Queen, and that is total of 5 power. Our opponent plays either 2 blockers or a blocker plus a removal spell. That leaves us with, we have 2 power left over. We can Torch Face at the end of their turn, and that's still valid because we have enough power left over. On our next turn, we Madness Mocto, we play our Queen, Nostrix blocks the Mocto, Merchant blocks Crunch, and then 2 other blockers blocks the Queen plus the Merchant that we have on board now, and that means that our 2/2s and our 1/1s of the Silenced Champion of Fury, and then the 2 Grenadins, that leads to a total of 8 damage, and that still works, assuming that our opponent plays a removal spell. The math still checks out the exact same way, and remember, our opponent is at 10, given the fact that we have the Nightfall trigger as well, so this will technically 1 additional damage more than we need. But this is not... So this whole activity, this whole purpose, and I could technically go further in some of the other turns to do a little bit more of this, but the purpose of doing this is to show how you need to think about this deck and decks like this in order to find lethals. And I think that maybe what happens here is probably a few things. Now, this is after a long day. I don't want to, push, Paradox too hard. I've had bad games. I would suck to have my, bad games televised, for hundreds of people to watch. In this case, it was here. I, very much respect him as a player. This was just not one of his best games. Perfectly understandable. But, given that this is a pretty rough game, and I think that part of the reason why is because we see all these enticing options, and that's what you see with these kinds of decks. What makes them hard is that you have to earn your wins in a lot of cases. But the Karenin Merchant is such a trap of like, okay, maybe there's a way to turn the combust plus the madness into a lethal somehow. Maybe if I seal this and then do that, and like that kind of thinking, when you get too far down that line, I think is the easiest way to you waste all this time, spend all this time, get frustrated, and not make the correct plays as a result. Definitely not playing with the Merchant here and is holding it in hand. That's a pretty big punt, because basically like most of the cards in your market, you deal with damage. I guess the only question is, the 3 of them are very similar. The only one that's different is the combust that's up there. I guess maybe there might be a reason to get it, but given the fact that it usually needs a little bit of damage to finish off the game, I think that you just need to play that out. That just having that 3/2 body in play is so valuable. So I find that's the only part of this that I don't think is as forgivable, but emphasizes the importance, finding creative lethals, don't get locked into these little trap ways of thinking. Also, think through the damage logically to the end too. Don't get distracted of like, okay, what if I do this? And then just like try and play first for asking, how do I maximize damage? And you maximize damage this turn. And if you had done that thinking, there's a pretty good chance that he finds the lethal lines that he needs to here. But anyway, with that, that'll be it for today. Thank you so much for joining me. I've been Neon. This is brought to you by a+space Games. Be sure, of course, to check out our partner, Ink Gaming, who's done a lovely job supporting us, and you can use the code a+space12 to get 12% off your orders. That's everything for today. Thank you all for joining me once again. Take care, everybody.